probably the craziest story that we've ever been involved with has just come to a conclusion. Recently, a court in California, a federal court, held that a group of companies controlled by Chinese billionaire named Liu Zhongtian were criminally liable for evading about $1.8 billion in U.S. tariffs. This story is something that started more or less with a report that we did, Muddy Waters, pseudonymously. Back in 2015, caught up with the funds that's pretty smart money, and they said to us, this is right up your alley. There's this company listed in Hong Kong called Zhongwang, and they've got over $1 billion of aluminum just sitting in the desert in Mexico. This thing's a fraud. My first question was, well, what would the point of that fraud be? I mean, if you've got $1 billion sitting in Mexico, where did the money come from? Now, what we didn't know at that time, but would later find out, is that this is money, roughly $5 billion, that we think had been just defrauded out of Chinese banks. And what we were seeing was the laundering taking place. But right after they brought Zhongwang up, Freddie said, oh yeah, I know that company.
So China Zhongwang is funny because it was always a fraud. The fraud changed from being just a traditional stock market fraud to something a bit realer and much wilder. But I remember from when I was working at a hedge fund in Hong Kong prior to Muddy Waters, Zhongwang had listed. Typical at the time for some of these Chinese companies, they didn't give you the customer list. And so it was, customer A, B, C, and then maybe they told people who a few of the customers were, just through some pretty rudimentary checks, some short sellers and I think some journalists as well, had called the customers up and basically asked them if they bought what they claimed off China Zhongwang, and they said no. So immediately after the IPO, there was a tremendous amount of skepticism as to whether the company's revenues were real, whether the company's customers were real, whether the factories were real. And, that probably should have been where it ended. But these guys had other plans. And I'm glad they did because, in all the work we've done at Muddy Waters, I think this was some of the most interesting, certainly some of the most shocking. And, I'm pleased to see with the recent pronouncement from the DOJ, work where we've ultimately been proven correct, albeit not without some significant financial cost and pain in between.
The Economic Observer, which is a mainland paper, reported at the time of Zhongwang's IPO that I think 5 of the customers that Zhongwang was claiming purchased from it were not purchasing from it or were not purchasing in those quantities. And then also the South China Morning Post reported that 2 of Zhongwang's claimed customers had lower annual revenue than Zhongwang claimed to be selling them in prior years. That automatically was the cause for skepticism there from the media. So Zhongwang claimed to be the second largest manufacturer of aluminum extrusions in Asia. Aluminum extrusions are aluminum forms that are commonly used in buildings, windows, and other products like those. The issue, though, is that the demand actually wasn't there. All of this stuff that it was producing was actually being bought by the chairman of the company, who had taken out these loans from PRC banks that at the time we were certain he would never repay, and I'm assuming never did repay. This was turned into aluminum extrusions, shipped overseas, but was not allowed to enter the United States without a massive duty attached to it. So most of it ended up in Mexico, some in Vietnam, some in Malaysia. And in Mexico, they were deprocessing it. They were taking it from this more finished product, an aluminum extrusion, melting them down into these enormous industrial-sized billets, and then trying to sell it onward.
I think it would be remiss if we didn't give credit to a journalist at Aluminum Metals Monthly, which I must confess is not something I had previously subscribed to and generally has not been a wonderful source of short ideas. This had the massive amount of aluminum in the desert in Mexico had not gone unnoticed by the aluminum industry and was actually causing a significant amount of concern. And so this journalist was, to my knowledge, the first guy who basically went, commissioned or took his own drone, flew it over these facilities and shot these amazing photos of what a couple $1 billion actually looks like, just sat there shining in the desert.
And the really funny thing is they applied the company in Mexico that they'd set up, which was actually owned by the chairman's son at one point. That company, Aluminacast, applied to the United States government to try to get preferences under NAFTA for sending this aluminum in. So basically, you're looking at this aluminum that I think was subject to an anti-dumping duty as of 2010, these aluminum extrusions. The U.S. government posed, I think, a 374% anti-dumping duty on these extrusions. Well, they were taking these extrusions, sending them to Mexico, remelting them into billets, and trying to get them into America with actual preferences from NAFTA. So that was a big part of what was going on. They did send some of these directly to the US, in particular to a company in California called Perfectus. And they didn't pay the duties on that aluminum because what they did was they took these extrusions, welded them together to make these pallets that they claimed were actually for shipping. But the average Zhongwang pallet, aluminum pallet, was about 165 pounds, which was way too heavy. I mean, aluminum pallets are a very niche market, but they'll weigh about 50 pounds. So anyway, they then sent all this into California, no end buyer for most of it, and the U.S. government ended up seizing a bunch of it, and that's when the U.S. government filed the criminal case alleging that the Zer0es and all these companies evaded the $1.8 billion in U.S. duties.
As we've discussed, there was kind of the stock market fraud angle of let's make up some customers and dump some stock on some unsuspecting punters in Hong Kong, which then merged this, well, let's defraud the US government as we try and do backflips to get into the US. But there was also an angle of fraud both on Chinese banks, which may or may not have been condoned. My strong belief is people at the banks were paid off, and I don't know if the banking system's underwater by hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. What's a few more billion to throw into that? And in addition, there was this land Ponzi scheme they had going on as well. So, I don't know if you want to call it innovative or just hand-to-mouth survival to keep robbing Peter to pay Paul, but they had multiple scams on at any one time. They had multiple people within the organization that were wearing multiple different hats depending on which entity they were in charge of and seemingly which day of the week it was. So it was really multifaceted and interesting in terms of the complexity of what was going on there.
I think it's easy to understate the significance of this, though, because when you looked at that time, roughly $5 billion in loans being taken out onshore by these shell these shell companies that were controlled by the Zer0es through proxies, these were empty boxes, right? So there's like $5 billion in capital flowing to them.
One of the interesting things about Zhongwang, too, is that it was an incredibly complicated fraud. But it was often known by members of the public, sometimes the companies, journalists, that there was a lot of monkey business that was going on. As we spoke with formers and employees of the company, suppliers, they would often say, yes, we know XYZ company is actually Zhongwang. Or we know that, these bank guarantees are given to this little empty box company because, indeed, it's actually the parent who is giving the support and giving the real bank guarantee.
There's this enormous network of guarantees, all these entities just swirling all around. And look, we might have not even captured the full extent of the amount of financing that came from the banks into this. But be conservative, call it about US $5 billion. Again, these loans were made to empty boxes, okay? No way, in my mind, that happened without the acquiescence, the approval of the most senior levels of government in the PRC. And that makes total sense to me because this is kind of like the triple play as far as I'm concerned for CCP officials. Because number one, it allowed Zhongwang to keep producing aluminum, so workers remained employed. Number two, it allows China to dump aluminum and degrade the US's industrial base further. So I think this is all part of the grand strategy that, we didn't really know China was employing until arguably recently. And then number three, and probably most importantly, this is real money. Like guys in the PRC government could dip their beaks into this, like $5 billion pot. So that's why I've long felt that this was the triple play, basically. And this was known about and approved of at the very highest levels.
Even though it may not be on paper, it's there. And I think that as we went through some of the research too, we found, I think it was in some of the bond prospectuses or some of the other credit reports, finding some undisclosed bank guarantees that were actually picked up in the credit reporting system. So in this regard, it's always interesting because as we kind of touched across the board, we kept finding, yes, somebody here knows that's Zhongwang. Somebody here knows that's Zhongwang. It kept coming up again and again. When we spoke to a former, it was actually a current employee of Zhongwang who had been working for Global Vietnam. He had said, quite literally, he had been seconded and sent down to Global Vietnam Aluminum in order to go work there and help them dial in their systems. This was one of Zhongwang's major undisclosed subsidiaries.
The first thing that we do when we look at a company in China is we start pulling government filings. And so we were pulling what are called these SAIC files on Zhongwang and its various entities. There was also an obvious undisclosed related party in this trading company called Dalian Liwang. And Dalian Liwang had originally been disclosed in one of Zhongwang's prior filings. And it was pretty clear that it was an empty box, but on paper, it was exporting enormous amounts of aluminum. So we looked into Liwang, but then we also found a couple of other entities that were just like Liwang. They were these trading companies, and these were all businesses that had really no substance to them, except they had enormous liabilities and enormous accounts payable because they were getting this aluminum that they were not going to pay for, and they were just exporting it. And often those exports would then go through these Singaporean entities that were controlled by a proxy of the Liu family. This guy, Eric Shen, and another guy named Johnson Shao. So we were pulling the Singapore filings and we saw the same thing. So we'd see this chain of custody basically from these trading companies. They were the last ones in China to touch the aluminum, at least from a legal title perspective, going through Singapore. So once again, huge debts, so huge accounts receivable, huge accounts payable, kind of matched up with what we were seeing from the PRC trading companies. And then we also had import-export records. So the export records from China were showing these Singapore intermediaries. And then we also had import records from Mexico, which were showing that the aluminum was being imported from these Singaporean intermediaries. So that's when the paper started to match up here. But we also began pulling credit reports. So People's Bank of China credit reports onshore in China. So we saw then that these three trading company entities were actually, there were guarantees to, in this, we started to unravel this network of guarantees that showed us there were these intermediary companies in between Zhongwang and the trading companies. And that for the most part, these intermediary companies, which were the ones that were actually borrowing money to pay Zhongwang, or they were really paying Zhongwang, that these companies were secretly controlled by the Liu's, with one exception. One of the intermediary companies was a state-owned enterprise think some aircraft engineering or aircraft engine production company. But that company had a public bond prospectus, so we could match up. We could see that pretty much everything it was buying from Zhongwang, it was selling to one of the three trading companies. So we're able to follow the movements on paper of the money going into the shell companies that buying the aluminum, the chain of custody of the aluminum, then to the trading companies, to Singapore, to Mexico, to Vietnam, and even to Malaysia.
I think one of the interesting things about the research on this is it really touched on probably it was the most multifaceted research project we've probably done. So it covered not just the usual SEICs, credit reports, filings, and when we look through the wide range of customs and import-export data, China export data, U.S. import-export data, Mexico import-export data, going through Southeast Asia, pulling Hong Kong filings, Singapore filings, company records from throughout China plus the U.S., on-the-ground due diligence, plus lots of calls with formers, talking to suppliers. It was one of the most, there were many aspects of it where it was among the most adventurous projects ever done. But at the same time, it turned up some of the most bizarre moments. So, everything from container tracking, going from the ports in Liaoning province down to Vietnam and trying to figure out where the containers went and staging investigators on the other side of the port to try to catch the containers coming back out and follow them down the road to the plant, to having investigators trying to scope out the facilities in Mexico and understand how big that might still be. It was definitely very complex.
Yeah, this project was real brain damage, not gonna lie. Whether it was trying to match up Singaporean filings with what we were finding in Vietnam as the Zer0es had decided to transship through either Vietnam or Australia. Trying to keep a track of what was going on at what point was really tough. Trying to put that down on paper was incredibly challenging because these were some of the most complex flows of people, ownership, money, and goods that we probably have ever looked at.
Why did we do this pseudonymously? It was the Ass Watch. The Ass Watch. There was this huge facility in Mexico, Aluminacast, had $2 billion of aluminum sitting outside. Not a lot of this was moving. So we wanted to find out what was going on. We had paper that showed that Liu Zuoping, who was Liu Zhongtian's son, so the chairman of Zhongwang's son, owned Aluminacast, which, by the way, was like a $200 million investment. And this 20-something-year-old kid, made it, right? And there was actually a great quote that we looked at from his father, Chairman Liu of Zhongwang, said that it's okay to give your kids some money for business, but never do business with them. But, clearly that was just a head fake. So we've got the paper showing that Liu Zuoping owns Aluminacast, but what actually is going on? So we engaged an investigation firm, and they had people talk to the security guards, and like this place was a fortress. Razor ribbon everywhere. We also got satellite imagery. So we used this one firm that had former National Reconnaissance Office satellite data interpreters or overhead imagery analysts working for it. And when they're reviewing the images of this Aluminacast facility in Mexico, they noticed not only the concertina wire, but there were two sets of walls. There were various watchtowers. So they asked us at one point, is this a military installation? And we said, well, it shouldn't be. We don't think so. And the goal was to try to get somebody inside the facility to take a look at what was going on and to record it. So it took a while to set things up, but apparently they had a source who was going to go in and do it. Now their source had once been a prisoner in Mexico. And I guess that's important because he was wearing, when he went to the facility, one of those watches that has a camera and a microphone on it. So the hidden camera. And the story that I heard was that he was going into the facility and dudes with machine guns everywhere, apparently, and up on catwalks, like a prison.
As the investigator was progressing through the facility, they were preparing to go back into some like ultra secure part of it. He had to go through some type of a security checkpoint, and at that point, he pretty much lost his.
And then there was a metal detector, and they were going to have him walk through the metal detector. So he realized that this could be actually a really bad thing if he got caught by these people wearing this watch. He asked to go to the bathroom, went to the bathroom, and apparently he took the watch off and shoved it up his ass.
All I know is the story we heard was, a not insignificantly sized watch did disappear inside a man's ass. And based on the fear he had that the repercussions of not doing that would be much worse, he was very happy with his decision.
I didn't have the footage, but when we heard that, we said, well, we don't know what the is going on here, but maybe this is different than other projects we've done.
So in the end, why didn't we do it as Muddy Waters? It's the ass watch.
That was just an amusing story, but it was clear that these are very serious guys.